Thank you to Orun Chimikbaksh, and thank you all. I will be, again, along the lines of Dr. Clark here, I'll be touching a bit more on some themes of cultural heritage preservation as opposed to research. So I imagine some things will kind of pop up about research that, so please feel free to touch on those in questions or in discussions later if you like. But my talk today is going to be about 3D scanning in Mongolia, particularly as it applies to archaeology. So we're going to first kind of talk about some cultural heritage concerns based on my own experience, which is, again, focused on a pretty limited segment of the archaeological record, but I think it's a nice case study for examining some bigger issues. And then some ways in which 3D scanning may be able to help those and bring kind of a unique perspective to research, from a research side of things as well. So the focus of my dissertation studies and a lot of my ongoing research is essentially on two things, which are kind of closely linked, and that is Bronze Age archaeological sites, specifically monuments, which you can see depicted here, deer stones and hurgsurs. So you've heard a fair amount about this discussed today, so I won't necessarily repeat it all, but also on horses and animal burials from these ritual contexts, which you see this nice image drawn by my wonderfully talented mother in the bottom right here. But these are kind of the data sets from which I'm going to explore these bigger themes throughout the talk. These come from kind of a wide swath of Mongolia, but based on some of our recent research, these horse bones that I'll be discussing over and over again today tend to pop up in Mongolia at approximately 1200 BC, and for centuries and millennia thereafter, a critical part of the archaeological record. So I'm just going to start off by very briefly touching on some cultural heritage issues that have come up in the course of my own research before getting into why 3D scanning or 3D technologies might have an important role to play there. Some of those are very practical and familiar to many archaeologists. Many of us come in from a foreign research perspective, and we have a specific research goal. Perhaps we've been working in the same location for years and years, and so our concerns are a bit different. But I've been a part of, as a poor graduate student, I feel like I shared a lot of the concerns of the more typical kind of CRM-focused Mongolian archaeologist, where you may pop up at a new site and you may have 1 to 2 hours to map it before you hop in the car and you move on. For example, here's some rather disappointing work produced by myself when I was essentially tagging along in the car with some colleagues as we explored an entire region of northern Bayan Hongor. And as the extra pair of hands, they said, okay, map this site. We've got about 2 hours, and here's the GPS, and go. And this was a bit overwhelming of a task, and you can see that while I'm of course proud of myself at my little circles here, that the quality of this sort of thing, there's a limit here on to how valuable, how correct, and how valuable this kind of documentation is. And so this is a key concern in Mongolia, is the time it takes to do quality site documentation is an important, and it's a limitation. And many times all we're able to produce is simple sketch map, and often the circles are even worse or sparser than what you see before you here. And so that's one of the things I'll talk about a bit. Another is site preservation, and many of you may also be familiar with this. I worry, in fact, that many of the resurgent archaeological projects that we're engaged in are often followed up a few years later by stuff that looks like this, which there's actually a Facebook group now where people have just sort of put up the local carnage from their area that they've been working in, and looted monuments or burials, or many times looting looting sites which have no prospect of containing, shiny objects, gold or artifacts, but are nonetheless, being destroyed at sometimes a kind of an alarming rate. And then this is the key, this is the topic that I know the most, which is the conservation of archaeological materials and specifically faunal remains. So in Mongolia, being such a center of pastoral life and, domestic animal use, we have a lot of animal bones. And these are an incredibly valuable resource, at least to an archaeozoology-oriented person. But they often look like this, which is essentially a pile of dirt and fragmented bones. This is often what they look like before, when they've come out of the ground, but before they've been traveled in a bumpy van across the country and then put into a museum collection and then handled by researchers. And so this is a key pressing concern in terms of cultural heritage management. And it's one of the richest, most important pieces of Mongolia's cultural heritage. So I'll talk about 3D scanning, but before I end up sitting here and talking about the work of myself and Dr. Clark and my co-author Nicholas Case here, I'd like to point out that Mongolia really actually has in many ways led the charge for applications of 3D technologies in terms of both research and cultural heritage preservation. And I can't do justice to all the work that's been done on this, but I would like to highlight a few things. So one of the early applications of this was the Smithsonian project, who did many summers of detailed documentation of deer stones, which have been mentioned again several times. This was using, I think here we've got like a structured light scanner, so it's being done in tents or in the dark of night. Some very adventurous kind of cutting edge research. But this, a lot has happened. So this was kind of a very cutting edge early application of an important topic here. Mongolian Cultural Heritage Ministry itself has been engaged in a lot of this work in a way that I think is not being matched. For example, I worked in a museum in New Mexico for several years, and we have yet to lift a finger with some of this stuff in terms of 3D scanning on our collections, making the data publicly available. So there's been a lot of work done at the Cultural Heritage Center. And again, I've seen 3D scanning, 3D technology incorporated into a lot of these other foreign archaeological projects. I occasionally see something popping up on Facebook in French language showing detailed 3D models, or German. And so it's really kind of a rich set of research that's been going on that I don't have time to do justice to. So I just want to make sure that I outline that before moving on. And so here's a cool one where actually a researcher at the Cultural Heritage Center, Altensuch, has done a lot of this 3D scanning stuff, and they fit a broken piece of a stone monument back on in this particular example. So really, both a really kind of practically valuable cultural heritage conservation component here. There are many different kinds of 3D tools, and I'm not going to get into the logistics of them, but I'm going to focus on two here that have been a major focus of my own research, which are kind of short-range laser scanners, like a desktop, tabletop laser scanner, and digital photogrammetry. And these are the focus of my talk for two main reasons. First is, and they're eminently practical reasons. And the first is cost. They're relatively low cost. And the second is accessibility. They're relatively easy to use. They're relatively portable, flexible. And so these make them particularly valuable for the concerns of the researcher working in Mongolia. And so I'd like to just talk about, just briefly, the methods. For my dissertation research, I did a lot of desktop laser scanning of faunal remains from archaeological sites. And so that essentially consists of placing a material in a fixed position in front of a small portable laser scanner, and then either rotating the object or rotating the scanner to produce a detailed model. 3D photogrammetry essentially comes down to taking a lot of pictures from many different angles and then using computer algorithms to identify common points and kind of stitch them together to produce a three-dimensional model of an object, an archaeological site, etc. And this can be done both with your average, attached lens digital camera, or it can be done as highlighted in one of Dr. Clark's slides. It can be done using aerial photography as well with drones. So some of the applications of this for the cultural heritage issues that we outlined before include 3D mapping of archaeological sites. So again, in the same interval that I, bailed out of my Russian van and running everywhere with a notebook and a pen and a GPS and a meter tape, in the same interval that it takes to do such a mapping effort, you can also do 3D aerial drone photography, and you can get a map that looks something like this. So this, the resolution of this is not necessarily apparent from a zoomed out view, but you can get down to, you can see the Russian van that I bailed out of there in the top right, and down to very detailed, depending on things like the surface vegetation and what have you, potentially quite an excellent three-dimensional map in the matter of minutes, essentially. And just for comparison, my sort of garbage sketch map, which I guess when I made it, I didn't know it would be the kind of straw man that I just destroyed in public like this, but at least it's serving a useful purpose. So it's also got some other applications on a smaller scale as well for site documentation. So here's a sketch map I did from a horse burial, which Dr. Erdenbotzer talked a bit about this tradition, an important part of the Mongolian archaeological record. But this was a sketch map that took me quite a long time to produce, and I was at the time quite proud of my efforts. Drawing rocks. It's a skill I learned from Bill Fitzhugh, and it's quite it's a difficult task. It's time intensive, and it's very valuable, right? There's a lot of data here in terms of the structure of this, the construction of this particular stone object, and the orientation of the skull. In this particular one, we actually found a bronze knife laying on the stone here. There's a lot of contextual information which potentially quite fascinating and important to document if time intensive. We didn't mean to do this, but we were in the process of trying to get a nice top-down photo in order to produce a sketch map here. We ended up taking quite a lot of photos, and we didn't delete them. And then my student over here, Nick, got to processing our 3D models of deer stones and aerial maps and accidentally produced a 3D model for this horse mound, which has, and you can't quite see it as well here, I shouldn't have done the bright background, but it contains all of the three-dimensional depth of this particular horse feature in terms of the pit, its structure, the location of the horse head, all of this in a matter of 19 photos, which that was a bit too many. I was really fiddling with it, trying to get the photo right, but that in the grand scheme of things, that's an absurdly low amount of effort to produce a really nice, useful three-dimensional model that maintains much more information than I've ever squeezed into a sketch map. What we'll talk about now is documentation of deer stones, and this is a technology that is just to compare with what 3D scanning a deer stone would have been like in say 2006 when the Smithsonian was leading the cutting edge, and what effort it takes now is really quite amazing. So here's a model of a Saiyan Altai style deer stone with a lot of really intricate carvings from our work in Beinhongor this summer, which was produced in about 45 minutes of kind of walking around in a circle, photographing this stone with a handheld personal camera. And I'd like to highlight a few things that this approach potentially has in terms of interpretive advantages, which are really incredible. And they're related to the potentially things like subjectivity. So here's an image. This is often what you see with the deer stone. It is covered in raptor excrement. You can see potentially some carvings here, but it's really quite. I oftentimes am just kind of staring at these, and Mongolian archaeologists I'm working with kind of chalk an outline of what they see, and I'm always often mystified as to how did they even see anything here. But so here's often what a site report will look like from. This is the same image here, done through sort of careful and experienced study. And here's what the 3D model looks like. And you can see, in fact, that most of this is correct. It seems as if there's the body of a large deer, but there's a lot more ambiguity here than is being represented in the initial sketch here. It's really hard to see, and it's, I think, important to maintain that as much as possible when documenting these sites. I'd like to give an alternative example, and this is a deer stone which was documented by Bayersachen, and you can see these nice, interesting carvings and a lot of kind of ambiguous areas. So here's one image I'd like to highlight, what looks like a kind of a duck-looking deer here. And then when we did the 3D model, again, this is all covered in bird excrement, so it's a bit hard to see. When we did the 3D model, in fact, the image itself is completely different. And this is not through the fault of any one of the interpreters here, but it's just simply impossible to see unless you run your fingers through, and even then, and there are other elements of the image that are popping out here. You can kind of see the end half of this moose or whatever it is as well, emerging through this 3D documentation, which took less time than the original chalking and photography by far. Yeah, and again, I often end up looking like this. Here's an entire axe that materialized from the 3D documentation that did not exist before. And then I'm running out of time, but we had this whole cliffside which was covered in indented hoof prints into a kind of a soft metamorphosed sandstone. And you can only see them at 2 times a day and otherwise essentially invisible. But we were able to get a 3D model made through photogrammetry, which shows all these beautiful indentations, like a whole herd of horses ran across, except it's sandstone, not mud. But otherwise, it's so that's really nice application. And then there's some really cool applications here for faunal conservation and for research. So, for example, often we get horse bones that look like this, and it was a nice, good quality bone preservation, but smashed into X number of pieces. And through 3D scanning, we can refit these and produce something akin to an intact skull. And so the kind of research analyses you can do with an intact skull and with a 3D model are really kind of nice. You can do things in terms of what we call retrodeformation or fossil fixing, which is using the natural symmetry of the cranium to kind of reconstruct it. And these are sloppy example applications that I came up with. But this is commonly done in paleontology, and it's something we can do to make the most out of our fragmented faunal remains. There's also research applications which nobody plans for. And for example, one of the big finds from my dissertation is these morphological features of skulls, which I never identified ever using the naked eye, but which are apparent through 3D models that I had produced and sitting around on my own computer. So these are deformations to the skull caused by a bridle here. And then the ability to do precise and kind of goofy measurements here that might be traditionally hard to do with the calipers or with a ruler. You can do it digitally using these models. Morphometric shape comparisons to reconstruct phylogeny, look at species identifications or domestication effects, etc. And then you can share them really easily. So they're really easy to share with the public. We've had a lot of success putting these things online, getting them out on social media. And you know, in terms of sharing as a database, you can preserve so much more information than a lot of traditional techniques. And so just as a final wrap up, here's Nicholas presenting his poster at the SAA, and he essentially create an immersive virtual reality where people can literally walk around and explore the deer stone in front of them. And the number of astonished faces here was just incredible. Here's one example. And that's the afterwards. So that was not a setup photo. That's just the. So the opportunities for public engagement here are pretty incredible. And so I think that we have the opportunity to build on Mongolia's track record of being at the forefront of this 3D scanning for conservation, and to really use that to address some of the key challenges which are admittedly getting to be quite pressing in some areas of the archaeological record. And we have the added advantage of this being actually a lot easier and in fact cheaper, or at least not appreciably more expensive than the techniques that are already being practiced, which it's hard to overstate how important that is. For most of the research that's done in Mongolia is done, you know, at the CRM level, where there's concerns for time, resources, and energy, and 3D scanning, I think, is the kind of optimal solution to handle those circumstances. And so I'll stop yapping there, but I did want to make a plug for ACMS and making some of these technologies publicly available to Mongolian and foreign researchers at no cost. So yeah, thanks to the funding sources for this research and to everyone for organizing this conference. So I'll open it up to questions. Should I call directly, or okay? Yeah.
But what is your opinion about preserving the art of drawing?
Preserving the what? Sorry.
Actual drawing.
The drawing.
There is a crisis in architecture
Yeah.
because suddenly nobody can draw.
Yeah, that's true.
We live in buildings which are unlivable.
Yeah.
So also the human connection
Sure.
to the
yeah, I take your point, and in fact, I chose here a nice example where for example, we were talking about the mapping of this site, where all of these mounds are nicely visible from the sky, but anyone could point to you a number of other archaeological sites where you've got features that require, you know, an archaeologist's intuition, and they're not necessarily visible in an easy way from the sky, and you could find carving images as well. I personally think that their greatest value is in tandem. You know, assuming you have the time and energy to have one person sketch and the other person do photogrammetry, they're a nice counterbalance to each other, because you can catch things when, hey, I couldn't see what this carving was, but the 3D model shows like a pair of antlers. This kind of thing, I think they work most effectively as complementary, and because they're not that much extra effort, I think they can be used that way. Yeah.
If you could say a little bit more about the use of drones,
Mm-hmm.
because I would think, you know, given the vastness of the country, that would be an ideal tool for at least aerial surveying and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think we're just scratching the surface in terms of the utility of drones. I mean, we began experimenting with drones this summer because it was almost criminal not to. You can buy drones in Ulaanbaatar for cheaper than you can buy them on eBay, and they proved to be immensely useful in the field. But I think that now is the time for people to really push the limits of what they can be used for research-wise, because now it's possible, instead of you know, putting some GPS points on an aerial map, you can potentially be putting them on a 3D model of an entire landscape, and the kinds of research applications for that I don't even know how to effectively answer what they may be, but I imagine that it's a important thing to.
Bouncing along in a Russian van.
Yeah. Yeah, you can just watch yourself bounce along in the van on the 3D model. Yeah. Dr. Rogers?
I just wanted to say, I don't think you should feel too badly about that map with the little circles on it.
Oh.
I thought it was okay.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I'll give it a B plus, I guess, but